Hi everyone, today's video is going to be a little longer than usual because I'm trying to fit in a whole bunch of things, like the first gay rights group, the flourishing of a gay subculture in Germany in the early 20th century, and the persecution of LGBT folks during World War II. It's a lot, and I'm going to try and serve the totality of it as best I can, but this is just a brief overview. I wanted to keep these things together because I think each part of the story informs the ones around it. Just FYI, my German pronunciation is terrible, but I'm going to give it my best shot. In 1897, a group of people in Berlin formed the Wissenschaftlich Humanitäres Komitee, or Scientific Humanitarian Committee, to lobby against anti-gay laws in Germany, including paragraph 175 of the Criminal Code, which outlawed sex between men. Led by the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, the committee was the first gay rights group in the world. Coming a generation or so after the coining of the word homosexuality and the work of the first gay rights activists like Karl Ulrichs and Karl Maria Kirchner. See episode 1 for details. Hirschfeld was at the vanguard of those using the most up-to-date science to fight against societal and legal attitudes that treated homosexuality as deviant and criminal. He wasn't alone in this, but he was probably the most prominent scientist working on those issues at the time. In fact, he was sometimes promoted as the Einstein of sex. Hirschfeld was the Scientific Humanitarian Committee's first chair, and the committee was emblematic of his motto, through science to justice. Like Ulrichs and Kirchner before him, he argued that sexuality was an innate trait rather than a chosen one, and by this reasoning, it was cruel and pointless to criminalize same-sex activity. To give you an idea of the kind of things that he did with the committee, Dr. Hirschfeld often served as an expert witness for the trials of men charged under paragraph 175, arguing for leniency in the courts. In doing so, he often succeeded in getting the sentences reduced for his client. For his part, Max Spohr, one of Hirschfeld's partners in the committee, involved himself in the activist push by publishing sexological studies and popular gay literature. With titles like Die Transvestiten, or The Transvestites, these books spread the committee's ideals across Europe. Germany was uniquely suited to this tactic, given that censorship laws at the time were fairly liberal. Despite this leniency, Spohr and other publishers occasionally came into conflict with the government, such as when he published homosexual and anarchist Adolf Brand's literary journal Der Eigene, which had explicitly gay content. This, and other propaganda from the committee, turned sentiment among many of Germany's elite against anti-gay laws. Many of the texts published by Spohr's press included both academic journals and longer scientific papers from Magnus Hirschfeld. Dr. Hirschfeld founded an institute in 1919 to further work in the field of sexology, or the study of human sexual behavior. Hirschfeld's Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, or Institute for Sexual Science, occupied a large building in central Berlin, where Germans could go for help with a number of sexually related issues, from birth control to gender transition services, and which housed a museum devoted to human sexuality. Under Hirschfeld, the committee also circulated a petition among elites to urge the government under Kaiser Wilhelm II to repeal the anti-sodomy law. This petition even made it to the floor of the Reichstag, or the parliament, in 1898, though the statute was not then overturned. The committee and other gay rights groups continued pushing this agenda even after the Wilhelmine government gave way to the Weimar Republic after World War I. A vote in 1929 promised to reform the law. Activists called the reform one step forward and two steps back, though this too fell through. Hirschfeld resigned his chairmanship that same year following this last attempt. So, what was gay life like in Germany at this time? Around the turn of the 19th century, police in Berlin began an informal policy of monitoring but not raiding establishments that catered to homosexuals. This allowed gay nightlife to flourish in the city. By the end of the 1920s, Berlin was well known throughout Europe as a center of homosexual life, especially for those who were well off. Clubs and bars that served gay clientele and featured cross-dressing entertainers were even established enough to warrant guided tours. It wasn't all wine and roses, however. Despite relative freedom, homosexuality was still a punishable offense, and thousands ended up in prison as a result of paragraph 175. Moreover, the Berlin police position of non-intervention didn't really extend to the rest of Germany. The openness of Berlin's attitude towards homosexuality was always tenuous at best, and relied upon a fairly liberal society. After the Great Depression hit, and the collapse of the German economy on top of crippling reparations imposed by the victors of World War I, the previous open conditions gave way. By the time the National Socialists, or the Nazis, seized power, an atmosphere of fear, anxiety, and plain old xenophobia had made it much easier for those in power to scapegoat marginalized groups within Germany. Despite the promise of the reform movement, paragraph 175 continued into the Third Reich. After seizing power, the Nazis began campaigns against those they deemed degenerate. And much like leftists, Jews, persons with disabilities, and Romani, thousands of homosexuals were sent to concentration camps. These prisoners wore a pink badge in the shape of a triangle, marking their crime as homosexuality. This pink triangle was revived as a symbol by gay rights groups later in the century, most notably by ACT UP during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. What is your damage? Gay prisoners went through the same torture, privation, and cruelty as others in the camps. By the end of World War II, only about 40% of those who had been sent to concentration camps because of their sexuality had survived. And yet for many, even liberation came with a cost. Both governments in divided Germany maintained anti-sodomy laws on their books well after the war, and even re-imprisoned those who had been released. East Germany made amendments to the law beginning in the 1950s, and overturned it in the 80s. West Germany amended their law in the 1960s, though full repeal didn't occur until after reunification in the 1990s. As for Magnus Hirschfeld, he was away on a speaking tour when the Nazi Party took power. He never returned to Germany, and died in exile in 1935. The Nazis sacked his institute in May 1933, destroying the Sexological Museum and burning the institute library, including Hirschfeld's research and the research of his colleagues. Being a Jew and a reported homosexual, as well as a liberal sexologist, Hirschfeld was a powerful symbol for them to attack, and it was unlikely he would have survived returning to his country. You'll notice that women are excluded from this narrative thread. In large part, it's because paragraph 175 only criminalized same-sex activity between men, and because the scope of Nazi repression of lesbians was substantially different, tending towards circumscribing the role of women as mothers and wives rather than by outright imprisonment. Hirschfeld, for his part, welcomed women into the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, and worked on feminist issues of the time, like decriminalizing abortion. Others in the same movement, like Adolf Brand, tended toward dismissing women and lionized masculinity as the greatest ideal, as part of the Männerbund, or the male association movement. Now, I don't know how many of you have run across the idea of Nazis as being gay, but it's something that I've witnessed personally. To be sure, some of the earliest Nazi leaders, like the head of the Brown Shirts, Ernst Röhm, were gay, but the power of these leaders within the Nazi government was short-lived. Röhm himself was one of many assassinated in 1934 during the Night of the Long Knives. There's no doubt in my mind that the Nazis were virulently homophobic, and that's where I'll leave that idea. Just one last point, although this video is already quite full. Hirschfeld's approach, and the approach of the committee, necessarily left out a lot of people who were adversely affected by anti-gay laws, primarily the working class and sex workers, although those are often one and the same. For this and other reasons, the movement as a whole broke down along ideological and class lines, and it's possible that effectiveness suffered as a result. It's taken me a while to figure out how to approach this episode, because I see real parallels between what I'm discussing here and what our landscape looks like today in the US. That being said, I don't want to give the impression that I think the election of Donald Trump is exactly analogous to the rise of Nazism in Germany. There are, however, a lot of troubling similarities, and I'm not holding out hope that things will get better soon for marginalized people in the US. I'm passionate about history because there's nothing new under the sun. What I've been trying to do throughout this series, whether consciously or unconsciously, has been to illustrate the strategies and tactics by which people have tried to foment change. Sometimes, like in our first episode, it's by defining the issue, by giving us vocabulary to talk about it. Sometimes it's through spontaneous and physical resistance, like with Compton's Cafeteria in episode 6. Occasionally it happens within the system. More often it comes from outside. Change doesn't always stick, and it's never easy. Progress doesn't always win. And that kind of sucks. So what can we do? We can pay up for people whose work has helped us out. With money if you can, by signal boosting if you can't. Support your local library. I wouldn't have access to most of the materials I've used in this series if it weren't for my library. There's a million things to do. They're just a search away. There's so much more out there than I managed to fit in this video, so don't just take my word for it. Take a look at the resources in the description, and there's a link to the transcript as well. You can follow me on Twitter, you can follow the show on Tumblr, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. In 1897, a group of people in Berlin formed the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, or the Wissenschaftlich... God, I'm so bad at this.